Witness this. Teutoburg Forest, dawn, 7 CE. Arminius stands on a ridge, watching a Roman column emerge from the mist below. He's counted 400 warriors in position, hidden in the trees for 6 hours, waiting for this moment. The Romans' number may be 200, supply carts visible in the rear. Undermanned patrol. Perfect target. He's seen this 100 times in auxiliary service. Standard Roman formation, predictable spacing, shields catching first light. His hand moves to signal the attack, then stops. Something's wrong with the column. The gaps between legionaries are too wide, the front ranks moving in a pattern that makes no tactical sense. Then he sees them. Low shapes flowing between the soldiers' legs, dark forms the size of wolves, but moving with purpose that makes his throat tight. Molossian war dogs, 60, maybe 80 pounds of muscle each, spiked collars reflecting light like warning signals. He'd seen Roman camp dogs before, lazy things chained to posts, barking at nothing. These weren't those dogs. His sub-chief looks at him, waiting for the signal. Arminius opens his mouth to call it off, but the horn's already sounding. 400 warriors break from the trees, spears raised, war cries echoing off ancient oaks. 300 yards of open ground between them and the Roman line. Plenty of distance, plenty of time to close and overwhelm. Except the Romans don't form up to receive the charge. A single handler, scarred veteran, maybe mid-30s, walking calm like he's on parade ground, makes a hand signal. Just one gesture, no shouting. The dogs break from the column in waves, not random, coordinated. First wave hits the Germanic line 40 yards ahead of the Roman infantry, moving faster than men can sprint, low to the ground where spears can't track. Arminius watches a warrior in the front rank try to set his spear, try to brace for impact. 80 pounds of dog hits him at full speed. Physics takes over. The warrior goes down. The dog's jaws lock on his hamstring, shaking motion, tearing. A second dog goes for the throat before the man stops screaming. The ambush collapses in under 4 minutes. Not a battle, a controlled demolition. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. To understand why 400 warriors ran from 40 dogs, you have to understand what Rome had engineered. And what Rome had engineered took 20 years, 3 wars, and a breeding program that turned shepherd dogs into precision weapons. 6 months before that forest, Lucius Verus stood in a commander's office at Colonia Claudia on the Rhine frontier. Mid-30s, shoulder scarred from a Gothic spear that had ended his frontline career. The legion commander looked at him with the expression, "Officers reserved for men they're about to ruin. You're being reassigned. Canis program needs experienced men." Lucius understood immediately. Dog handler meant desk job, meant has-been duty, meant watching younger soldiers march out while he stayed behind managing kennels. He'd lost his place in the line. Now he was losing his dignity. The commander saw his face. It's not punishment, it's necessity. Go see the kennels before you decide it's beneath you. Lucius went because orders were orders. The kennels at Colonia housed 60 dogs segregated by temperament and function, organized with the same precision Rome applied to everything. Whelping areas, training grounds, medical stations, breeding records on wax tablets stretching back 30 years, tracking lineages like aristocratic families. Each dog cost the equivalent of 3 months' legionary salary. Each one represented calculations about aggression, intelligence, pack behavior, bite force. This wasn't animal husbandry. This was weapons development. The head trainer was a Greek named Kleitos, older veteran with rope-scarred hands and a face that suggested he'd stopped being surprised by violence decades ago. He walked Lucius through the program without preamble. You think these are pets? They're not. You think training a dog means teaching it tricks? It doesn't. Watch this. He gestured to a scarred molossian in the training yard, maybe 7 years old, muscled like a blacksmith's forearm. The dog sat motionless 30 yards from a padded target dummy. Kleitos raised his hand. The dog's eyes locked on. Kleitos made a single gesture. The dog exploded forward, hit the dummy at full speed, jaws crushing into the throat area, shaking, tearing. Kleitos made another gesture. The dog released instantly, returned to sitting position, eyes tracking Kleitos for the next command. 17 men, Kleitos said. That dog's killed 17 men. I know because I count. You want to know the trick? We don't train them to hate. We train them to hunt. Hate makes dogs stupid. Hunting makes them patient. Lucius spent 3 months learning what patience meant. The Molossians Rome bred weren't the shepherding dogs Greeks had developed in Epirus centuries earlier. Those dogs guarded flocks, barked at predators, operated on instinct. Rome took that foundation and spent generations selecting for specific traits: aggression paired with control, prey drive paired with obedience, pack coordination paired with handler focus. The failure rate was 40%. Puppies that showed fear washed out. Dogs that couldn't obey instantly washed out. Animals that became too aggressive, too independent, too anything that didn't fit the tactical profile, removed from the program, sold to civilians, disappeared into history while their siblings became weapons. The training sequence took 18 months. Socialization with legionaries from 8 weeks onward, so the dogs learned to move through formations without chaos. Basic obedience by 6 months, but not pet obedience. Combat obedience, where a dog released at a target would disengage on command even while tearing into flesh, even while instinct screamed to finish the kill. Attack training from 6 to 12 months, teaching dogs to target specific body parts, to coordinate with pack members, to track scent over miles through forest and marsh. Combat integration in the final 6 months, running with infantry formations, learning to read hand signals at distance, performing in weather and terrain that made humans miserable. Lucius watched handlers work with young dogs in the training yard. One handler gave a command. The dog hesitated for 2 seconds before obeying. Kleitos immediately pulled the dog from the session. See that? That dog just failed. You know why? Because when I gave the release command, he thought about it for 2 seconds. In combat, 2 seconds means your legionary gets a spear in the back. The dog we want? He doesn't think. He obeys. Instantly. Every time. That's not cruelty. That's how you keep everyone alive. You've seen the paintings. Renaissance artists depicted Roman war dogs like noble hunting hounds, regal and decorative, poses suggesting obedience and grace. That's fantasy. The Molossians Rome bred weren't pets. They were 80-pound anti-personnel weapons with 400 pounds of bite force and 0 concept of mercy. Trained not to bark because barking alerts targets. Trained to target hamstrings, first because a man on the ground can't fight back. Trained to work in packs because 6 dogs hitting a formation from 3 directions creates chaos that infantry can exploit. The Greek shepherding dogs had protected flocks for centuries. Rome industrialized them. 3 months into his assignment, Lucius ran formation drills with his assigned pack. 6 dogs, full combat gear, integrated with an infantry sentry. He gave a hand signal. The dogs broke into a coordinated pincer pattern around target dummies, each animal hitting from a different angle, each one targeting a specific vulnerability. Perfect execution. But when Lucius looked down at his lead dog, a male he'd started calling ferox for the way the animal watched threats, the dog wasn't focused on the target. He was watching Lucius, waiting for the next command, evaluating whether his handler would make the right decision. That's when Lucius understood. He wasn't training the dogs. They were training him, teaching him to think like a pack leader, to make decisions faster than thought, to trust that when he gave a command in chaos, these animals would obey even when every instinct told them to do something else. The injury that had ended his frontline career had felt like losing his purpose. Standing in that training yard, watching ferox wait for guidance, Lucius realized he'd found something different. Not replacement purpose, evolution. But here's what Rome had actually created, stripped of the mythology. A war dog program that cost enormous resources to maintain. Each dog required 2 to 3 pounds of meat daily, which meant dedicated hunters and butchers. Exercise demanded 2 hours minimum every day because a bored molossian became a dangerous molossian. Medical care required specialist veterinarians, usually Greek, expensive and rare on the frontier. The total monthly cost of the program equaled the salary of 50 legionaries. Every legion commander who looked at the budget saw the same equation. Why spend this fortune on dogs when you could hire more soldiers? The answer required understanding what Rome was fighting. The Rhine-Danube frontier stretched over 3,000 miles, held by 8 legions trying to contain Germanic tribes that refused to fight Roman-style battles. The old formula had been simple. Germanic warriors charged Roman shield walls. Roman discipline won. Repeat until the tribes submitted. But by 7 CE, that formula had broken. Germanic forces had learned to avoid open combat, to strike from forests where Roman formations couldn't deploy properly, to hit supply lines and patrols, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. Roman casualty rates on the frontier had climbed 30% over a decade. Soldiers sent dispatches home that never mentioned victory. They mentioned exhaustion. Rome needed something that could track through forests where visibility stopped at 50 yards. Something that could move faster than Germanic scouts could retreat. Something that could turn the asymmetry problem around, make the enemy afraid to hide in the terrain that had been their greatest advantage. The Molossian program was Rome's answer. Not the only answer, but the one that required the least change to Roman tactical doctrine. Infantry could still fight the way they'd trained. The dogs just made sure the enemy couldn't avoid the fight. Lucius spent 6 months in the program before the deployment orders arrived. The Rhine Frontier Command wanted a field test, not a full legion commitment, just enough to evaluate whether the investment was justified. 40 dogs, 8 handlers including Lucius, attached to a garrison fort in Germania, where patrol casualties had been running 3 soldiers per week to ambushes nobody could prevent. The reception from regular legionaries was exactly what Lucius expected. Mockery, skepticism. One veteran centurion looked at the dogs and asked what he was supposed to do with expensive pets when what he needed was 30 more infantry. That centurion had lost 23 men in 3 months to ambushes his patrols couldn't stop. The dogs sat in their kennels eating meat that could have fed soldiers while Germanic warriors kept hitting Roman forces and vanishing into forests that swallowed pursuit. Every failed patrol proved the centurion right. Every dog that stayed in the fort while legionaries died in the trees justified his contempt. Then dispatch arrived from high command. They wanted results, proof the program worked, or admission that it didn't. The garrison commander looked at Lucius and 8 handlers with 40 dogs, representing a small fortune in imperial investment. You get 1 chance. Make it count. But to understand why that chance came in the worst possible circumstances, you have to understand what was moving in the forest. And what was moving in the forest wasn't a random collection of raiders. It was a coalition led by a man who'd spent 6 years learning exactly how Rome fought, exactly where Roman tactics failed, exactly when to spring a trap that would swallow an entire command. Arminius had served in auxiliary units long enough to earn citizenship. He knew Roman marching formations, camp construction, signal protocols, supply requirements. He knew their strengths. More importantly, he knew their blind spots. He'd gone home and built an army designed to exploit every one of them. 15,000 warriors organized across multiple tribes, positioned in terrain where Roman discipline became a liability, waiting for the moment when Rome's frontier command would do exactly what doctrine demanded: send a punitive expedition deep into hostile territory to restore order and project strength. The math was simple. Rome needed to demonstrate control. That need was predictable. Predictability was fatal. The expedition that marched out numbered 2,600 men, standard composition, proper logistics, experienced officers. They had 8 days of food, clear intelligence about Germanic positions, and confidence backed by centuries of tactical superiority. What they didn't have was accurate intelligence. The report said 3,000 enemy warriors. The reality was 15,000, dug into prepared positions, waiting in a forest specifically chosen because it turned every Roman advantage into a death sentence. Lucius marched with that column. 40 dogs in the supply train, handlers told to keep the animals ready but not committed. The program was expensive. Commanders didn't risk expensive assets until regular forces had secured the situation, which meant the dogs would stay in reserve while legionaries walked into an ambush that would kill over 2,000 men in less than a day. Unless something changed, unless someone with authority understood what Rome had actually built and was willing to gamble everything on 40 dogs performing in circumstances where failure meant annihilation. That understanding came too late for the front ranks. But for the 600 soldiers who survived to see the forest edge again, 40 dogs made the difference between dying in Germanic territory and walking home. Arminius had planned for Roman infantry, Roman tactics, Roman doctrine. He hadn't planned for 80-pound weapons that hunted with coordination infantry couldn't match and obeyed with discipline that made Germanic ambushes impossible to maintain. 400 warriors had run from 40 dogs, because in that moment, watching the ambush collapse as Molossians tore through positions that should have been secure, Arminius understood something that changed his entire tactical calculation. Rome didn't just have better soldiers. Rome had turned evolution itself into a weapon system, and you couldn't ambush evolution. Call it the greatest empire in history. Call it unbeatable legions and iron discipline. But read the letters Roman soldiers sent home from the Rhine frontier in the first decade of the Common Era. And the word that appears again and again isn't victory. It's exhaustion. By 7 CE, Rome had conquered most of the known world through a simple formula: trained infantry in tight formations against enemies who fought individually, discipline against chaos, engineering against impulse. The formula had worked from Spain to Syria. Then it hit Germania, where the trees grew so thick that formations couldn't deploy and the enemy refused to stand still long enough to be conquered. The frontier stretched over 3,000 miles from the North Sea to the Black Sea, held by 8 legions trying to contain populations that outnumbered Roman forces 20 to 1. Not a wall like later emperors would build, a line of forts and watchtowers and camps connected by roads that required constant maintenance and constant blood to keep open. Every legion deployed to the frontier knew the arithmetic. 40,000 soldiers, scattered across 600 miles of Rhine border alone, facing Germanic tribes that could field 5,000 warriors on a week's notice and vanish back into forests before Roman reinforcements arrived. Lucius had learned this arithmetic the hard way. His first 5 years in the 5th Legion had been Spain, then Gaul, then finally Germania, where the tactics that worked everywhere else started failing. A patrol would march out at dawn, 200 men in good order, following reports of raiders 3 miles into the forest. By noon, they'd be strung out in single file because the trees grew too close for proper formation. By evening, they'd return with 20 men wounded and no contact with the enemy, or they wouldn't return at all, and a recovery party would find them 3 days later, butchered in an ambush nobody had seen coming. The Germanic warriors had learned not to fight Roman battles. They'd learned to make Rome fight Germanic battles in terrain where every advantage legionaries trained for became a liability. The shoulder wound that ended Lucius's frontline career happened exactly that way. Standard patrol turned ambush, trees so thick he couldn't see the spear coming until it hit. The legion surgeon saved his arm, but the damage went deep enough that he couldn't lift a scutum properly anymore. In formation combat, if your shield drops, you're dead, and the man beside you is dead, and the formation breaks. The centurion who'd kept Lucius alive through 4 years of Germania sat beside his bed in the medical tent and didn't sugarcoat it. You're done in the line. Not your fault, but done. Request a transfer to logistics or accept a discharge. Lucius had requested logistics, got dog handler instead. At the time, it felt like the difference between retirement with honor and being put out to pasture. 6 months later, standing in a kennel watching Molossians coordinate an attack drill with precision that made infantry look sloppy, he understood what the 5th Legion actually needed wasn't more soldiers. It was a different kind of soldier entirely. But Rome's problem wasn't just tactical. It was mathematical. Every patrol that went into the forest required 500 pounds of equipment per soldier. Armor, weapons, tools for building overnight camps, rations, water, medical supplies. Germanic warriors traveled light, maybe 30 pounds total, because they weren't building camps and they knew where every stream and cache was hidden. When Romans tried to match that mobility by splitting into smaller units, they became vulnerable. When they stayed in large formations, they moved too slow to catch anyone. The asymmetry was killing them one patrol at a time, and the casualties were adding up to strategic failure masked by tactical reports that called every survived ambush a victory. Enter Arminius, mid-20s, born to a Germanic tribal leader who'd made accommodation with Rome rather than resist. Smart enough to see that Roman power wasn't going anywhere, practical enough to join it. He'd served 6 years in auxiliary cavalry units, the kind of service that made provincials into citizens and gave ambitious young men from conquered territories a path to status their fathers couldn't imagine. 6 years of learning Roman drill, Roman camps, Roman logistics. 6 years of watching legionaries march in formations that worked brilliantly in open ground and failed predictably in forests. 6 years of understanding that Rome's strength was also Rome's weakness, because discipline meant predictability, and predictability meant vulnerability if you knew where to look. The auxiliary service had been real soldiering. Arminius had fought in Pannonian campaigns, had taken the same risks as Roman citizens, had earned decorations that proved competence. But competence came with observation, and observation came with understanding. He'd watched Roman commanders make decisions based on doctrine rather than terrain. He'd seen patrols march into obvious ambush sites because the tactical manual said this was how you cleared hostile territory. He'd learned that Rome's advantage came from turning warfare into system, but systems had rules and rules created patterns, and patterns could be exploited by anyone patient enough to study them. When his service term ended and he returned to Germania, the tribal confederation looked different through eyes that understood Roman organization. 15,000 warriors scattered across multiple tribes wasn't an army by Roman standards. No supply trains, no siege equipment, no capacity to hold territory against a legion operating at full capability. But those warriors knew every trail through forests that would swallow Roman columns, and they could field 500 men for a raid within hours and disappear before reinforcements arrived. They had mobility Rome couldn't match and terrain knowledge Roman maps couldn't capture. What they didn't have was coordination and timing. That's what Arminius brought home. The tribal council met in a hall built from oak trees that had been old when Rome was still a city-state fighting Latin neighbors. 15 chiefs representing populations that ranged from 3,000 to 20,000, each one jealous of status and suspicious of coordination because the last time Germanic tribes had unified it had ended with Roman legions burning their settlements. Arminius stood before them and made the case with facts they couldn't dispute. Rome is stretched thin. They've got 8 legions holding a frontier that needs 20. Their commanders are under pressure from the capital to show progress, which means they'll take risks to get results. If we hit them now, hit them hard enough to break a major expedition, we can make this frontier too expensive for Rome to hold. An older chief, scarred from wars against Rome before Arminius was born, asked the obvious question. They broke us before, 3 times. Why would this time be different? Arminius had the answer because he'd lived it. Because before, you fought them their way. Open battles. Your courage against their discipline. Courage loses to discipline every time. But I know something you don't. Roman doctrine isn't built for forests. Their formations don't work in thick terrain. Their supply lines get vulnerable when they're far from forts. Their commanders make decisions based on reputation, not reality. Because failure in Germania means shame in Rome. We don't need to beat them in battle. We need to make them come to terrain where they can't fight properly, then bleed them until the cost is higher than the Senate wants to pay. The council agreed because the alternative was eventual defeat through piecemeal subjugation. Rome didn't need to conquer all at once. They just needed to keep pushing, one settlement at a time, until accommodation became submission, and submission became occupation. Better to fight now while they had numbers and motivation than wait for Rome to bring more legions and grind them down. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. 15,000 warriors from 8 tribes would coordinate operations, share intelligence, and prepare positions in Teutoburg Forest, where the trees grew so dense that 3,000 years of root systems had created a maze no formation could navigate properly. Arminius sent scouts to map every path and prepare fallback positions. He cached supplies at intervals, small dumps of food and weapons that would let his forces fight for weeks without returning to settlements. He established communication networks using runners who knew the terrain so well they could move at night faster than Roman cavalry could during the day. And he started the raids, small ones at first, testing Roman response times and doctrine. Supply caravans hit just hard enough to draw patrol responses. Border settlements raided and burned to create pressure on frontier commanders to retaliate. Every action calculated to provoke exactly the response Roman doctrine demanded: a punitive expedition, large enough to be decisive, deep enough into territory to make a statement. That was the pattern. Arminius had seen it in Pannonia, had watched Roman commanders make the same play again and again because it usually worked. and deviation from doctrine usually ended careers. He told his sub-chiefs exactly what would happen. They'll send 2,000 men, maybe 3. They'll march 4 days into our territory, expecting to find our main force in open ground where they can deploy. Instead, we'll be in the forest, dug in, supplied, 20,000 in prepared positions, and we'll destroy them. The logic wasn't complicated. It was just ruthless. Make Rome commit major forces to terrain that neutralized their advantages, then use superior numbers and preparation to win through attrition rather than pitched battle. Arminius had learned from 6 years of auxiliary service that Roman soldiers were brave and disciplined and extraordinarily well trained. He'd also learned they were predictable, and predictability was fatal when facing an enemy who knew the schedule better than they did. Back at Colonia Claudia, Lucius didn't know any of this. He knew the raids were escalating. He knew patrol casualties were climbing. He knew the garrison commander was under pressure from higher command to pacify the region, which was military language for get results or be replaced. What he didn't know was that the solution to unpredictable ambushes was sitting in his kennels waiting for commanders who understood what they'd actually built. The Molossian breeding program hadn't started in Germania. It had started 20 years earlier in Epirus, when Roman forces occupying Greek territory had encountered shepherding dogs that worked with capabilities legionaries couldn't match. Tracking scent over miles, operating in coordination without verbal commands, attacking on instinct but ceasing on command. A Roman tribune named Marcus Corvus, who'd later make general, had watched these dogs work and seen something military planners had missed for centuries. Dogs had been used in warfare before, usually as shock troops or intimidation. But nobody had systematically bred and trained them as force multipliers that could extend infantry capabilities into terrain where formations didn't work. Corvus had started small, purchased 20 breeding pairs from Greek farmers, established a program at a garrison in Macedonia, began selecting for traits that military operations required: aggression paired with control, prey drive paired with discipline, pack coordination paired with handler focus, intelligence paired with obedience. The early results were mixed because nobody knew what they were doing, and half the dogs washed out of training for temperament problems or health issues. But over 3 generations, patterns emerged. Certain bloodlines produced dogs that learned faster, obeyed better, worked harder. Those bloodlines got bred selectively, while others were culled from the program. By the time Lucius arrived at Colonia, the breeding records showed 30 years of careful selection documented on wax tablets with the same precision Rome applied to engineering projects. Each dog's lineage traced back through sires and dams, with notes on temperament, size, working ability, and combat performance. The investment was staggering. A trained war dog cost 3 months of legionary salary. The program required dedicated staff, expensive veterinary care, constant training, and resources that could have paid for 50 additional soldiers. Every legion commander who looked at the numbers asked the same question: why spend this fortune on dogs? Cleidos had been explaining the answer to skeptical officers for a decade. Greek by birth, veteran of auxiliary service who'd transitioned to animal handling, he'd learned dog training from shepherds before Rome recruited him into the program. He'd tell junior officers the same thing every time. You want to catch raiders in forests where your formations don't work? Dogs can track scent through terrain where you're blind. You want early warning for ambushes? Dogs can smell enemy positions from hundreds of yards. You want to break formations that rely on your forces getting pinned in kill zones? Dogs move faster than infantry, hit harder than surprise, and don't follow the tactical manual your enemies have already memorized. The training sequence took 18 months minimum. Puppies socialized with legionaries from 8 weeks so they'd learn to move through military formations without chaos. Basic obedience by 6 months, but military obedience was different from civilian. A dog that obeyed eventually was useless. Military dogs had to obey instantly under stress with distractions and noise and violence happening around them. Attack training from 6 to 12 months. Teaching dogs to target specific body parts, coordinate with pack members, track scent over distance in all weather. Combat integration in final 6 months. Running with infantry units, learning hand signals at 100 yards, performing in exhaustion and injury. The failure rate stayed at 40% despite decades of selective breeding. Some puppies showed fear early and got culled. Some dogs couldn't learn to disengage from targets on command and got removed before they became liabilities. Some animals were too independent, too reactive, too anything that didn't fit the precise operational profile. The dogs that made it through to full certification represented an investment of time and resources that made junior officers wince. But those dogs could do things infantry couldn't. And on the frontier where ambushes were killing 3 soldiers per week, capabilities mattered more than cost. Lucius watched handlers work with young dogs in the training yard 3 months into his posting. A handler gave a release command. The dog hesitated 2 seconds before attacking the target. Cleitos immediately pulled the dog from training. Lucius asked why. Cleitos explained it like combat doctrine. In an ambush, 2 seconds means a legionary gets killed. The dog we want doesn't think. He obeys, instantly. That dog thought about whether to obey. He's done. That's when Lucius understood what Rome had actually engineered. Not pets, not even just weapons. A biological system that functioned with the same reliability Roman infantry had spent centuries perfecting, but with capabilities infantry couldn't match. Speed, scent tracking, coordination without verbal communication, psychological impact on enemies who'd learned to predict Roman tactics but hadn't planned for 80-pound molossians hitting from angles shields couldn't cover. The program worked because it solved problems tactics couldn't, and on the frontier where the old solutions were failing, new solutions were worth any cost. His lead dog, the male he'd started calling Ferox, demonstrated the concept during a formation drill. Lucius gave a hand signal from 100 yards. 6 dogs broke into a coordinated pincer pattern without verbal commands, each animal hitting target dummies from different angles with timing that suggested collective intelligence. But when the drill ended and Lucius looked down, Ferox wasn't celebrating or seeking praise. The dog was watching Lucius, waiting for the next command, evaluating whether his handler understood what came next. That look changed something fundamental. Lucius realized the dog wasn't waiting for orders. The dog was watching to see if Lucius was smart enough to use what 40 generations of breeding had created. The dispatch arrived on a gray morning when rain turned the training yard into mud that smelled like wet dog and old leather. Garrison Command wanted the dog program attached to a punitive expedition. Not for combat, for tracking, to prove the program justified its cost. 2,200 legionaries, 400 auxiliary cavalry, 8 days of supplies, marching deep into Germanic territory to suppress raiders and restore order, which was military language for find someone to punish, so command looks decisive. Lucius read the orders and felt his stomach drop. He'd been on punitive expeditions before, back when his shoulders still worked properly. They followed a pattern. March out. Find nothing, because the enemy knows you're coming. March back. Call it a success. But something about this one felt wrong. The intelligence reports showed maybe 3,000 enemy warriors. The commitment level showed 2,600 Roman soldiers. That ratio was too even for comfort. Rome usually committed overwhelming force. This felt like command gambling on intimidation rather than superiority. He requested additional handlers and more dogs. Request denied. Budget constraints. The program would deploy with 40 dogs, 8 handlers, including Lucius, attached to the reserve elements where they could be protected from frontline casualties. Protected, meaning held back unless regular forces needed help, which meant the dogs would sit in safety while legionaries who'd mocked them walked into whatever was waiting in those forests. Unless something changed. Unless the situation got bad enough that commanders stopped protecting expensive assets and started using the capabilities Rome had spent 20 years engineering. Lucius looked at Ferox the night before the expedition marched. The dog didn't know they were about to walk into Germania, where trees swallowed armies and ambushes turned discipline into death. Ferox just knew Lucius was tense, which made the dog alert but not anxious. Waiting. Ready. Trusting that whatever came next, his handler would make the right decision. That trust felt heavier than armor. The column marched at dawn. Standard formation, proper discipline. Experienced officers who'd done this before. Day 1 was routine. Day 2 was when the forest started getting dense and scouts stopped finding solid contact. Day 3 was when the dogs started alerting constantly, tracking something large moving parallel to the Roman column. But patrols returned with nothing. Lucius reported to the tribune. Dogs are tracking multiple groups, large numbers, organized movement. They're not scouting us. They're surrounding us. The tribune nodded, but didn't change course. Germanic scouts always shadow our movements, standard procedure. Day 4 morning, Lucius watched the column prepare to advance toward reported enemy positions. Officers confident, formations tight, discipline holding, everything by the book. Ferox sat beside him, head cocked, ears forward, tracking something ahead that Lucius couldn't see. The dog looked up at him with an expression that suggested judgment, or maybe warning. Lucius had learned enough in 6 months to understand what 40 generations of selective breeding produced. Not just obedience, intelligence. And intelligence meant Ferox knew what Lucius was still figuring out. They were marching into something Rome's tactical doctrine hadn't prepared for, and the only thing standing between survival and annihilation was whether commanders would finally use what 20 years of breeding had created. The raids started small. Supply convoy ambushed 20 miles from Colonia. 3 wagons burned, 8 soldiers dead. Standard frontier harassment. Then a week later, border settlement hit at night. 12 families killed, livestock driven off. Then another patrol ambushed. This one only 5 miles from a major fort. 15 legionaries dead before they could form defensive positions. The pattern was escalating in ways that suggested coordination rather than opportunism. Germanic tribes didn't usually operate like this, with systematic targeting and withdrawal discipline that prevented Roman counterstrikes from making contact. Someone was organizing them. Someone who understood exactly how to make Rome respond. Arminius had learned patience from 6 years of auxiliary service. The raids weren't about casualties. They were about political pressure, the kind that traveled from frontier forts to provincial headquarters to Rome itself through dispatch riders who carried reports that made senators nervous and emperors angry. Each incident got documented. Each Roman death got counted. Each failure to catch the raiders got noted by officials whose careers depended on Germania looking pacified and profitable. The math was simple. Make the frontier expensive enough and unpredictable enough, and the political class would demand results from commanders who had limited options for delivering them. By late autumn, the garrison commander at Colonia was receiving dispatches from higher authority 3 times a week. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Pacify the region or be replaced. The commander was a career officer named Gaius Velius, 22 years in the legions, veteran of campaigns in Gaul and Hispania, where Roman tactics had worked exactly as designed. He knew how to win pitched battles against enemies who stood and fought. What he didn't know was how to stop ghosts that hit supply lines and vanished before his cavalry could respond. The political pressure was turning into career threat, which meant Velius needed decisive action even if the tactical situation didn't support it. The staff meeting where Velius made his decision happened on a cold morning when frost made the headquarters building feel like a tomb. Senior officers around a map table, clay models showing terrain and troop dispositions, everyone understanding that this meeting was where reputations lived or died. The intelligence reports showed Germanic forces massing somewhere east of the Rhine, maybe 3,000 warriors based on scout estimates and informant reports. Velius looked at the numbers and saw an opportunity. 3,000 enemy warriors meant a force large enough to matter, but small enough to destroy with proper Roman deployment. If he could catch them, force them into open combat, crush them decisively, he'd solve his political problem and restore frontier stability in one action. His senior tribune, a younger officer named Marcus Fadius, who'd transferred in from Syria 2 months earlier, asked the obvious question. Where exactly are they massing? The scouts haven't given us precise locations. Velius pointed to a region on the map table. East of here, 45 miles into contested territory, Teutoburg Forest approaches. The scouts report organized camps, supply gathering, patterns suggesting they're preparing for sustained operations. That's thick forest, sir. If we advance in force and they refuse battle, we'll be exposed during withdrawal. Which is why we advance with overwhelming strength. 2,200 legionaries, 400 cavalry, enough force to crush their formation if we make contact, and enough mobility to pursue if they break. We march, we engage, we destroy them. Then we're done with this before winter. Fadius didn't argue further, because arguing with garrison commanders about operations was how junior officers ended careers. But Lucius, sitting in the back of the room because dog handlers ranked below combat officers, saw the problem immediately. 45 miles into hostile territory, with 8 days of supplies, meant 4 days advance, 1 day to engage, 3 days return. No margin for complications, no resupply, no reinforcement if the intelligence was wrong and the enemy force was larger than estimated. The entire operation depended on reports from scouts who'd been operating in a region where Germanic warriors controlled every trail and could feed Roman intelligence whatever story served their purposes. The expedition composition got finalized that afternoon. 5th Legion would provide 1,800 legionaries. Auxiliary cohorts would add 400 more infantry and 400 cavalry. Support elements included medical, engineering, and supply personnel. And because the dog program needed to justify its cost, 40 molossians and 8 handlers would deploy with the reserve elements. Clydos found Lucius in the kennels after the briefing and said what they were both thinking. This feels wrong. Lucius had been checking Ferox's equipment, making sure collar spikes were secured and leather harness wasn't chafing. Intelligence estimates are too clean. 3,000 warriors in prepared camps. That's exactly the kind of report that makes commanders confident, which means it's exactly the kind of report an enemy would feed us if they wanted us to march out. Can you tell Velius? I'm a dog handler. He thinks I shovel shit and manage pets. Why would he listen? Kleidos looked at the 40 dogs that represented 20 years of breeding and 2 decades of tactical development. Because if the intelligence is wrong and we walk into a real fight, these animals might be the only thing that saves anyone. And Velius won't commit them until it's too late because he's protecting the investment. That night, Lucius requested a meeting with Velius. Got denied. Requested a meeting with Fadius. Got 5 minutes before evening muster. He laid out his concern as directly as military protocol allowed. Sir, the dogs have been tracking increased activity for 3 weeks. Pattern recognition suggests forces much larger than 3,000. Multiple groups, coordinated movement, logistics that indicate sustained operations beyond raiding capacity. Thaddeus listened because he was professional enough to hear intelligence from any source. You're saying the dogs have better reconnaissance than our scouts? I'm saying the dogs can't be fooled by false information. They track what's actually there. And what's actually there is an enemy force that's been moving parallel to our patrols for weeks, without engaging. Which suggests they're avoiding contact until conditions favor them. That's not raiding behavior. That's preparation. I'll mention it to Velius. But dog handler testimony isn't going to override scout reports and informant intelligence. The decision's made. We march at dawn tomorrow. The column formed up as sunrise turned frost into mist that smelled like cold earth and equipment oil. 2,600 soldiers in standard formation, supply wagons in the center, cavalry on flanks, dogs held with the reserve elements at the rear. Lucius walked with his handlers, Ferox and 5 other lead dogs staying close. The rest of the pack spread through the dog handlers section. The dogs sensed something was different, not anxiety, alertness. The kind of focus working dogs get when they understand the job is starting and the stakes are real. The march discipline was perfect. 5 miles before noon, overnight camp constructed in 3 hours, perimeter secured, watch rotations established. Everything by the book, because Roman military doctrine had been refined through centuries of campaigns, and everyone involved knew their role. But by day 2, the forest was getting denser and the formation was stretching. Trees grew too close for proper spacing. The column extended over a mile from front to rear, which meant communication between units required runners and delayed commands by minutes. The cavalry reported no enemy contact, but also no clear sight lines beyond 50 yards in any direction. That's when the dogs started alerting. Ferox would stop, ears forward, tracking something ahead or to the side. Lucius would signal the handler chain and other dogs would confirm. Something large moving parallel to the column. Not close enough for visual contact. Close enough for scent tracking. Every handler reported the same pattern. Multiple groups, organized spacing, coordinated movement. The dogs weren't tracking scouts. They were tracking formations. Lucius reported to Fadius during the midday halt. Sir, the dogs have been alerting constantly since we entered heavy forest. Whatever's out there, it's not small and it's not random. Thaddeus consulted with Velius. Velius made a decision that followed doctrine. Germanic tribes always shadow Roman movements. It's psychological warfare. They want us nervous. We maintain discipline and continue the advance. Day 3, the forest canopy blocked sun completely. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. The column moved through twilight at noon, every sound amplified by trees that had been growing for millennia. Scouts reported Germanic camp signs ahead, maybe 15 miles. Fresh tracks, fire pits, discarded equipment. Signs of hasty withdrawal. The pattern suggested the enemy knew Romans were coming and was pulling back to prepared positions. Exactly what intelligence predicted. Exactly what should have made someone suspicious. But Velius saw the camp signs as confirmation. They're running. We press them. That evening, constructing the marching camp took 4 hours instead of 3, because the ground was root-dense and digging was slow. The perimeter defenses weren't as solid as doctrine required. Soldiers were tired from 3 days of forest marching with full equipment. The mood wasn't fear. It was exhaustion mixed with frustration that they'd marched 3 days and still hadn't engaged the enemy. Some legionaries were joking that maybe the Germanic forces were myths and they'd march all the way to the Baltic, finding nothing but trees. Lucius didn't joke. He walked the dog handler section, checking equipment and watching the animals. Ferox and the other leads were tense in a way that suggested proximity to threat, not immediate danger, gathering danger. The kind of tension hunting dogs get when they know prey is close, but haven't gotten the release command yet. Kleitos appeared from the darkness, his Greek accent making the Latin sound sharp. They're surrounding us. I know. Does Velius know? Velius knows Germanic scouts are shadowing us, which is normal. He doesn't know we're walking into prepared positions with enemy forces that outnumber us 5-1. The dogs know. The scouts either don't know or aren't reporting it, and we're too far in to abort without looking like we're retreating from nothing. So we keep walking toward it. Unless something changes, yes. That night, the sounds started. Drums in the distance, war horns, Germanic chanting, not close enough to be immediate threat, close enough to prevent solid sleep. Psychological warfare that Roman doctrine taught soldiers to ignore, but ignoring something and not being affected by it weren't the same. By morning, the legion was operating on poor rest and growing nervousness, the kind of degradation that turns disciplined soldiers into stressed soldiers who make small mistakes that cascade into disaster. Day 4 dawn, orders came to advance toward the reported Germanic camp. Final push. Intelligence suggested the enemy force was concentrated ahead in clearing where Roman formations could deploy properly. Velius was betting everything on catching them in terrain that favored Roman tactics. If that happened, 2,200 legionaries would crush 3,000 Germanic warriors through superior discipline and training. If that didn't happen, if the intelligence was wrong or the enemy refused to fight in the clearing, the column would be 45 miles from friendly territory, with supplies running low and morale degrading. The advance began. The forest was claustrophobic now, trees so dense that visibility dropped to 30 yards. The formation couldn't maintain proper cohesion. First cohort was 200 yards ahead of second cohort. Communication required runners who were taking 5 minutes to move messages between units. The cavalry reported Germanic warriors visible ahead, maybe 1,000 strong, organized but not fortified. Exactly where intelligence predicted. Exactly what the tactical plan required. Velius ordered deployment. The column halted and began shifting from march formation to battle formation. This took 45 minutes because the terrain didn't allow clean deployment and units had to maneuver around trees and undergrowth. During deployment, Germanic warriors ahead made noise, visible aggression, but didn't attack. They were waiting, which should have triggered every warning instinct Velius possessed, but political pressure and career preservation have a way of overriding tactical caution. He needed a victory. The enemy was presenting what looked like a victory. He took it. Lucius watched from the reserve position. The dogs were with him, held back by doctrine because expensive assets don't get committed to initial assault. Ferox sat at his feet, eyes tracking the deployment, body coiled. The dog knew what Lucius knew. This wasn't right. The enemy was too visible, too organized, too willing to stand in terrain that theoretically favored Romans. Every instinct said the warriors ahead weren't the main force. They were bait. Fabius saw it too. He appeared beside Lucius as the first cohort began its advance. They broke too fast. "Sir?" The Germanic line. First cohort hit them and they routed immediately. Professional soldiers don't rout like that. They're pulling us forward. Toward what? Fabius didn't answer because the answer was becoming clear. Horns from the flanks, Germanic forces emerging from concealed positions. Not 1,000 warriors. Thousands, maybe 8,000 hitting both flanks simultaneously, emerging from trenches and camouflaged positions that had been prepared for weeks. The first cohort, already pursuing the routed enemy, was cut off. The second cohort tried to advance to support and ran into the same trap, screaming, Germanic war cries, Roman horns trying to signal retreat, but the signals were getting lost in chaos and forest acoustics. Velius, watching from command position, understood in the span of 5 seconds that he'd walked 2,600 men into an ambush that intelligence failures and political pressure had made inevitable. The Germanic force wasn't 3,000. It was 15,000. They weren't unprepared. They'd been waiting in positions specifically chosen to neutralize Roman tactical advantages. The entire intelligence picture had been manufactured to create exactly this scenario. A Roman expedition deep enough into hostile territory to be isolated, in terrain dense enough to prevent proper formation, facing enemy forces large enough to overwhelm through attrition. The first cohort was dying. 600 men cut off in forest, surrounded, unable to form proper defensive positions because trees prevented shield wall deployment. Close quarters combat where Germanic numerical advantage and terrain knowledge crushed discipline and training. The sounds coming from the forest ahead weren't battle. They were massacre. Second cohort tried to support, encountered the same fate. 800 legionaries pushing into forest, hitting prepared Germanic positions, getting torn apart by warriors who'd planned this engagement down to the individual ambush site. Velius made the decision that doctrine required. Sound retreat. Consolidate the reserve. We fight our way back. Fabius looked at what remained. Maybe 700 combat-effective soldiers, 400 auxiliary cavalry that couldn't operate in this terrain, and support elements that included engineers, medical personnel, and 8 dog handlers with 40 animals that represented the only tactical capability Rome possessed that Germanic forces hadn't planned for. "Sir, if we retreat in formation, they'll run us down. We're too slow, and they know every trail." "Then what do you suggest?" Lucius stepped forward before protocol could stop him. "Let us clear the path." Velius looked at him like he was insane. "You're dog handlers. The dogs can find their ambush positions before they're set, track their forces, locate concentrations, hit them before they can organize. Give the legion mobility it doesn't have otherwise. But we have to commit now, full deployment, before they close the trap completely. Those dogs cost more than our lives, I know. But if we don't use them, everyone dies, including the dogs. If we do use them, some of us might survive. That's the math." Velius had about 3 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether any Roman soldier saw home again. His career was over regardless. The expedition was a disaster. The question wasn't reputation anymore. It was survival. He looked at the forest where 2 cohorts were being butchered, looked at Germanic forces massing for a final push, looked at 40 dogs that Rome had spent 20 years engineering for exactly this scenario. Do it. Full commitment, whatever it takes. Clytos appeared beside Lucius, face grim. If we release them in this chaos, half won't come back. Lucius knelt beside Ferox, checked the dog's equipment one final time. Collar secured, harness tight. No leash because the dog would be fighting without direct control for the first time since training. Just hand signals and trust, and 40 generations of selective breeding that had created something Rome had never fielded before. He looked at Ferox. The dog looked back, not seeking reassurance, not afraid, just ready, waiting for Lucius to give the command that would turn biological weapon into deployed weapon. They know, Lucius said. They know some won't come back. They're going anyway. The handlers spread along what remained of Roman defensive positions. 40 dogs, coordinated deployment, waiting for release. Germanic forces 200 yards out, regrouping for final assault. Velius, Fadius, 600 exhausted legionaries watching dog handlers prepare to deploy assets that cost more than cavalry and had never been tested in conditions like this. The entire concept of war dogs was about to be validated or proven worthless in the next 10 minutes. There was no middle ground. Lucius raised his hand. Every handler's attention locked on him. Every dog's attention locked on their handler. This was it. The moment 20 years of breeding and training had been building toward. Germanic warriors in the forest ahead, positioning for the kill. Roman forces trapped, exhausted, outnumbered, with no tactical options except retreat that would turn into slaughter. And 40 dogs that had been trained to hunt in coordination, track in chaos, and obey without hesitation. He made the hand signal. Hunt. The dogs vanished into the forest like violence given form. No barking, no visible hesitation. Just instant transformation from stationary to moving, 40 animals dispersing into terrain that had swallowed 2,000 Roman soldiers and was about to find out what Rome had engineered specifically for this nightmare. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be a running slaughter. The only question was, who'd be doing the slaughtering? The dogs hit the forest at full sprint, 40 animals spreading into hunting formation without verbal commands. Lucius had trained them for coordination, but training and combat carried different weight. He watched Ferox lead his pack of 6 into the trees, body low, moving through undergrowth that slowed legionaries to stumbling pace. The dog didn't look back, didn't hesitate, just vanished into shadow with 5 others following, reading his movement and adjusting spacing like they shared one brain. The first sounds came 30 seconds later. Snarling pitched wrong, too low and methodical to be defensive aggression. Then Germanic screaming, high and shocked, the kind of noise men make when violence comes from angles they weren't watching. The forest ahead had gone from quiet to chaos in the span of a breath. Lucius couldn't see what was happening, but he could track it through sound. Dogs hitting positions, Germanic warriors trying to respond, more dogs hitting from different angles. Pack tactics playing out exactly like training, except the targets were screaming and the blood was real. Fadius stood beside him, watching the tree line. How long before we know if this works? We already know. Listen. The Germanic war horns were blowing retreat signals, not organized withdrawal, panic calls. The ambush positions that had been killing Roman cohorts for the past hour were breaking because 80-pound weapons were tearing through formations faster than warriors could reset. The dogs weren't fighting like animals. They were fighting like coordinated infantry that moved 3 times faster and attacked from angles shields couldn't cover. Velius made the decision that survival required. First century, advance behind the dogs, tight formation, were punching through while they're disrupted. 600 legionaries, what remained of Rome's combat-effective force, began moving forward. Not a charge. Controlled advance, shields locked, following the sounds of dogs working ahead. The first Germanic position they reached was carnage. 8 warriors down, 3 dead from throat wounds, 5 incapacitated with leg injuries that made standing impossible, 2 dogs circling, keeping the wounded contained, not killing, but not releasing. 1 warrior tried to crawl toward his spear. A molossian hit him from the side, 80 pounds of impact that rolled him over, jaws clamping on his sword arm, shaking motion that made bones snap audibly. The warrior stopped reaching for weapons. The legionaries moved past without engaging the wounded. No time, no purpose. The dogs had already done the work. Ahead, more sounds, more packs engaging more positions. The Germanic ambush line was a mile deep with warriors positioned every 100 yards to hit retreating Romans in successive waves. Except the dogs were finding each position before it could set, alerting Roman forces to exact locations, creating windows of opportunity that lasted maybe 3 minutes before Germanic forces could adapt. 3 minutes was enough. Roman shield wall would hit disrupted positions, kill or scatter defenders. Keep moving. The dogs would range ahead, find the next position, repeat. Lucius moved with the main formation, watching for handler signals. His second, a veteran named Gaius, who'd been training Molossians since before Lucius arrived, appeared from the forest with blood on his armor that wasn't his. Ferox's pack hit a major concentration, 40 warriors setting up a kill box. The dogs went through them like they were targets. I counted 9 down before the rest scattered. Casualties? 1 dog wounded, spear through the shoulder. He's still fighting. They kept advancing. The forest that had swallowed 2 Roman cohorts was becoming a corridor of disrupted ambush sites and Germanic forces falling back faster than they could regroup. The psychological impact was devastating. Germanic warriors had spent weeks preparing these positions, learning the terrain, positioning for maximum advantage. They'd planned for Roman formations, Roman tactics, Roman predictability. They hadn't planned for dogs that could smell their positions from 200 yards and hit with coordination that made human pack tactics look amateur. A horn sounded ahead. Different tone. Germanic rally signal. Arminius trying to consolidate his forces, stop the bleeding, turn chaos back into advantage. Lucius heard it and understood what it meant. The ambush had failed, but Germanic forces still outnumbered Romans 3-1. If Arminius could rally, establish a proper defensive line, force Romans to assault prepared positions, the numbers would matter again. Everything depended on maintaining momentum, keeping Germanic forces disrupted until the Roman column could reach open ground where formations worked properly. Ferox emerged from the trees ahead, limping on his left foreleg, blood matting his shoulder fur where a spear had caught him. The dog should have been done. Should have stayed with wounded animals being recovered by handlers. Instead, he was tracking toward the rally horn, moving slower but moving, pack mentality overriding pain because the job wasn't finished. Lucius intercepted him, grabbed the harness, felt the dog's body thrumming with adrenaline and combat drive. "You're done. You did enough." The dog pulled against the restraint. Not aggressive, but insistent. Still trying to advance toward the sound of Germanic forces regrouping. Cleitos appeared, saw the wound, made a decision. That's through muscle. Might have clipped bone. He keeps fighting. He won't have use of that leg afterward. Lucius held Ferox's head, made eye contact, saw the dog's pupils dilated from stress and pain, and the kind of focus that came from years of training, saying the mission mattered more than the individual. He'd seen that look in legionaries who kept fighting after wounds that should have dropped them. Discipline overriding biology. Except Ferox wasn't human and couldn't understand that some victories cost more than they were worth. Lucius made the call for him. He stays with me, out of combat. The dog fought the leash for 10 seconds, then submitted. Not because he agreed. Because Lucius had given a command, and 40 generations of breeding said commands were absolute. That submission felt worse than the wound. Lucius was pulling his lead dog from the fight while other packs were still working ahead, still taking casualties, still performing the mission that 20 years of engineering had created them for. The column advanced another mile. Germanic resistance was stiffening as warriors who'd scattered began finding each other, establishing defensive clusters that dogs couldn't break alone. The forest fighting was transitioning from dog-led breakthrough to infantry grind. Romans were winning the engagements, but winning was expensive. Every position cost minutes and casualties. The pace was slowing. Daylight was fading. If they didn't reach open ground before dark, Germanic forces would have all night to reposition, and the morning would bring fresh ambushes against exhausted legionaries who'd been fighting for 6 hours. Fadius appeared beside Lucius, armor dented, gladius bloody, face showing the kind of fatigue that came from sustained combat. We're 3 miles from where the ambush started, another 4 miles to reach ground where we can form properly. At current pace, that's 2 more hours. We've got maybe 90 minutes of daylight. Can we make it? If the dogs keep the path clear, maybe. But they're taking casualties, and Germanic forces are adapting. They're using longer weapons, staying in tighter groups, making the dogs work harder for every position. Arms race developing in real time. Germanic warriors learning that Molossians attacked hamstrings first, starting to wear leather leg wrappings and present spears low. Dogs learning that grouped warriors were harder targets, adapting pack tactics to isolate individuals before hitting them. Both sides adjusting, both sides paying the cost of education in blood and exhaustion. A runner from the forward elements arrived, breathless. Major concentration ahead. Arminius has rally point established. Maybe 2,000 warriors, blocking the path to open ground. The dogs found them, but can't break through. Too many spears, too much discipline. This was the moment Arminius had been preparing for. The ambush hadn't worked perfectly, but it had killed 2,000 Romans and degraded the survivors to the point where conventional engagement might finish the job. 2,000 fresh warriors in defensive positions against 600 exhausted legionaries was mathematics that favored Germania. If Arminius could hold that position until dark, he could reorganize during the night and complete the annihilation in the morning. The dogs had changed the tactical picture, but they hadn't changed the strategic reality. Rome was outnumbered, isolated, and running out of time. Velius called a halt to assess options. The remaining officers gathered, what passed for command structure after losing most of the senior leadership in the initial ambush. Tribune Fadius, Centurion Marcus from the second cohort, Lucius representing the dog handlers, because the handlers had become critical combat elements rather than support personnel. The map table was gone, burned or abandoned miles back. The tactical discussion happened in dirt, drawing positions with sticks, while Germanic war horns echoed ahead. "We assault the position," Velius said. "Standard formation, maximum pressure. Break them or die trying." Marcus, who'd been fighting in forests for 10 years, shook his head. 600 men against 2,000 in prepared positions? We'll get slaughtered. Alternative? Circle around, Find another path to open ground. That adds hours we don't have and moves us through terrain we haven't scouted. Arminius will track the movement and position ahead of us. We gain nothing except exhaustion. Fadius looked at Lucius. The dogs broke ambush positions. Can they break a defensive line? Not alone, but they can find weak points, hit the formation where it's thinnest, create gaps your infantry can exploit. Arminius is holding a position because he thinks Roman doctrine requires frontal assault. Give him something doctrine doesn't include. Velius studied the dirt map, calculating odds and costs. His career had ended the moment the ambush sprang. His life might end in the next hour. What he did now mattered only for whether anyone survived to report the disaster. Combined assault, dogs hit the flanks, create chaos. Infantry pushes the center when their attention splits. We break the line or we die. No middle ground. The plan was brutally simple because complexity required coordination they didn't have time to establish. 20 dogs, the ones still combat effective, would hit both flanks simultaneously. Infantry would advance once the flanks engaged. Standard shield wall. All the pressure Rome could generate with 600 exhausted soldiers. The remaining 20 dogs and handlers would protect the rear against Germanic forces still regrouping behind them. Everyone understood the mathematics. If the line didn't break in the first assault, there wouldn't be a second one. Lucius checked his remaining dogs. 18 combat ready, 8 wounded but mobile, 14 dead or 2 injured to continue. 45% casualties in 5 hours of fighting. The handlers had taken losses too. 2 dead, 3 wounded badly enough to need support. The remaining 6 handlers looked at Lucius with expressions that combined exhaustion and grim acceptance. They deployed an experimental weapons system into the worst possible conditions. The system had performed beyond expectations. Half of it was gone. Clytos appeared from treating wounded dogs, Greek accent making the Latin sound harsh. The ones left are the best, the smart ones, the ones that learned during the fight. We send them at that line, they'll know what to do. How many come back? Some, maybe half, maybe none. Does it matter? It mattered because every dog dead was 20 years of breeding gone, was knowledge and capability lost, was an animal that had trusted handlers to use them wisely. But wisdom was a luxury for peacetime. Combat required mathematics. 20 dogs attacking a 2,000 warrior defensive line might create enough chaos for 600 legionaries to break through. That was the equation. Everything else was sentiment. The assault formed up as sunset turned the forest into amber and shadow. Roman infantry in tight formation, shields locked. Every man, knowing this was survival or death, compressed into the next 30 minutes. Dog handlers on the flanks, animals leashed and waiting, body language showing readiness that came from training and combat experience combined. Germanic position ahead, visible through the trees, warriors in depth, spears forward, discipline holding. Arminius, somewhere in that mass, making decisions based on 6 years of auxiliary experience and detailed planning. He'd accounted for Roman tactics. He was about to discover what happened when Rome stopped following the playbook. Velius gave the signal. The dogs released simultaneously, 40 animals hitting both flanks in coordinated waves. Not random attack. Hunting pattern refined through 5 hours of forest combat, targeting gaps in the shield line. Going for legs and throats with precision that made human training look incomplete. The sound was immediate. Snarling, screaming, Germanic warriors trying to maintain formation while 80-pound molossians tore into positions that had no defense against animals moving faster than spears could track. The Roman infantry advanced, shield wall locked, moving at quick march, closing the distance while Germanic attention split between flanks and center. The timing was everything. Hit too early and Germanic forces could reset before chaos spread. Hit too late and the dogs would be expended without creating the necessary gap. Fadius judged it perfectly, calling the charge when Germanic center was already wavering, attention torn, discipline cracking. The collision was physics and momentum. Roman shields hitting Germanic spears, force meeting resistance, men pushing and stabbing and dying in the span of seconds. Close quarters combat where training mattered more than numbers because space was compressed and technique determined who lived. The Germanic line bent under Roman pressure but didn't break. Warriors in the rear ranks pushed forward to stabilize. It was holding. The assault was failing. Then the right flank collapsed. 6 dogs had found a weak section where younger warriors hadn't maintained proper spear formation. The Molossians went through that gap like they'd been training for this specific terrain configuration their entire lives, which they had because Kleidos had spent 2 decades teaching dogs to exploit exactly these vulnerabilities. The flank rolled inward as warriors broke and ran from animals that kept coming regardless of spear wounds or fatigue. Germanic center tried to pivot to cover the breach, which opened their formation to Roman pressure. The shield wall punched through, not clean breakthrough, not easy victory. Grinding advance where every yard cost casualties on both sides, but advancing, creating momentum, forcing Germanic forces to give ground or risk encirclement. Arminius saw it happening, saw his defensive line collapsing under pressure he'd planned against, but couldn't prevent, because dogs weren't in the tactical manual and adaptation takes time nobody had. He made the call that preserved his army. Fall back, reform at the forest edge, let them pass. The Germanic warriors withdrew in sections, maintaining enough cohesion to prevent total rout, but abandoning the blocking position. The Roman advance continued through the gap, infantry moving fast now that resistance had broken, handlers calling dogs back before they pursued too far and got isolated. The discipline was remarkable considering both sides had been fighting for hours. Romans maintained formation, because formation was drilled into them until it became reflex. Germans maintained enough order to retreat because Arminius had trained them for exactly this scenario. Both sides professional, both sides exhausted, both sides understanding that the forest fighting was transitioning to final phase. The column reached the forest edge 90 minutes before full dark. Open ground ahead, 2 miles of meadow before the tree line started again. Germanic forces at the forest edge. Maybe 3,000 warriors, watching but not pursuing. The mathematics had changed. Open ground meant Roman formations worked properly. Germanic warriors wouldn't leave the forest because leaving meant facing legionary discipline in terrain that favored Rome. The standoff was mutual understanding of tactical realities. Velius formed the column for final march to friendly territory. 600 survivors from 2,600 who'd marched out 4 days earlier. 77% casualties. The numbers would go in reports that would end careers and change frontier policy and become case studies in military academies. But numbers didn't capture what forest fighting cost in ways statistics couldn't measure. Soldiers helping wounded comrades walk. Handlers carrying dogs that couldn't walk anymore. Officers with 1,000-yard stares from watching formations break, and men die and tactical plans collapse into chaos that only desperate gambles had survived. Lucius carried Ferox because the dog's shoulder wound had opened during the final assault and walking was finished. The dog had killed 4 men, tracked 8 ambush positions, fought through pain and exhaustion until commands became suggestions and suggestions became biology. Now he was dead weight that smelled like blood and wet dog and the kind of exhaustion that came from complete expenditure. Lucius had ordered him out of combat 2 hours ago. The dog had ignored him, rejoined his pack during the final assault, fought until his body physically wouldn't respond anymore. That disobedience had probably saved 20 legionaries by breaking a strong point that held the Roman advance. Lucius wasn't sure whether to discipline the dog or recommend him for honors. The Germanic forces watched from the tree line, not attacking, not celebrating, just watching. Some warriors making gestures, not threats. Something else. Lucius saw one Germanic subchief, scarred veteran who'd probably been fighting Romans for a decade, touch his forehead in what looked like salute, not to the legionaries, to the dogs, the gesture of one warrior acknowledging another warrior's performance, or maybe acknowledging that warfare had just changed and everyone involved would need to adjust to new mathematics. The march across open ground took 2 hours. No one spoke, too tired, too shocked, too focused on putting distance between survival and disaster. The dogs that remained walked with handlers, moving on instinct and discipline because conscious thought was beyond them. 22 dogs from 40, 55% casualties. The breeding program would take years to recover. The handlers had lost 3 dead, 4 wounded, badly enough to end field duty. Cleitos walked beside Lucius, carrying a wounded dog himself, face showing the kind of grief that came from losing animals he'd trained from puppies. "Worth it?" he asked. Lucius looked at the legionaries who were alive because dogs had bought them survival. "Ask them." The fort gates opened as sunset painted the walls orange and gold. Garrison troops came out to escort survivors, medical personnel moving to triage, commanders receiving casualty reports that would travel to Rome and change how Empire thought about frontier warfare. Velius dismounted, armor dented and bloody, face showing a man who'd lost his command and saved remnants through desperate innovation. He found Lucius in the chaos, watched handlers carrying wounded dogs to makeshift veterinary station. "Your dogs saved my legion. What's left of it? They did what they were bred for. I'm recommending the program be expanded. Double the kennels, triple the handlers, establish breeding facilities at every frontier garrison. The Senate will ask if war dogs justify the cost. I'll tell them the cost of not having them is 2,600 dead instead of 800 survived. The arithmetic would matter in Rome. 800 survivors from expedition everyone had predicted would massacre Germanic raiders and restore order. The disaster would end careers, would change frontier policy, would force Senate to reassess Germania strategy. But 800 survivors was better than 0 survivors, and 0 had been the likely outcome once Arminius sprung his trap. The dogs hadn't won the battle. They'd converted massacre into survivable defeat. In frontier warfare, survivable defeat counted as strategic success. Lucius found space in the kennels for surviving dogs, made sure each one had water and food and medical attention, checked wounds that handlers had been too exhausted to properly address during the retreat. Ferox lay in straw, shoulder bandaged, breathing steady, eyes tracking Lucius with focus that suggested the dog was already calculating when he could return to duty. That focus was selective breeding and training combined. A dog that quit after being wounded wasn't useful. A dog that recovered and wanted back in combat was worth 3 months of legionary salary. Cleitos appeared with reports. 14 dead. 8 wounded badly enough they're retired from combat. 22 operational, but most need 2 weeks recovery before training resumes. The breeding program lost 4 females and 2 prime males. That's 3 years of genetic setback minimum. Can we recover? If they expand the program like Velius said, yes. We breed the survivors, select for traits they demonstrated today, build the next generation around combat-proven lineages. The dogs that survived weren't lucky. They were smart and tough and coordinated. That's heritable. We breed those traits. We get better dogs. The calculus was cold but accurate. The molossians that survived Teutoburg had been tested in conditions worse than training could replicate. The ones that performed best carried genetics worth preserving and magnifying. Rome would do what Rome always did: take battlefield lessons, systematize them, turn them into doctrine that became standard operating procedure. In 10 years, every frontier legion would have war dog units. In 20 years, Germanic tribes would be breeding their own dogs to counter Roman molossians. Arms race that started with 40 animals in a forest and would spread across empire because survival required adaptation. Lucius slept in the kennels that night, not because protocol required it, because the dogs that survived had trusted him to use them properly, and half hadn't come back, and the ones that did deserved someone present who understood what they'd done. Ferox lay beside him, body pressed against Lucius's side, warmth and breathing, and the smell of blood and medicine. The dog would heal. The shoulder wound was bad, but not crippling. 6 weeks and he'd be training again. 6 months and he'd be combat ready. But he'd never be the same dog who'd walked into Germania 4 days ago. Combat changed soldiers. It changed dogs too. Turned training into experience, turned theory into memory, turned weapons into veterans. The cost was 45% casualties and a forest full of dead molossians who'd performed exactly as 20 years of breeding had intended. The payoff was 600 legionaries who survived because dogs had given them mobility and reconnaissance and disruption capabilities Roman infantry couldn't generate alone. The calculus was military mathematics: input versus output, resources versus results, lives versus mission. Rome had made the calculation decades before Lucius ever reached Germania. Now they'd made it again in forest combat that validated every expensive decision the program had required. War dogs weren't experimental anymore. They weren't theoretical capability waiting for proof of concept. They were operational weapon system with battlefield performance data supporting expanded deployment. The innovation had cost lives. Animal lives and human lives and genetic lineages that wouldn't be recovered for years. But it had worked. And in military history, that's what mattered. Not whether the cost was high, whether the capability justified it. Arminius would report to his confederation that Romans had deployed something new, something his planning hadn't accounted for, something that changed tactical mathematics in ways that required response and adaptation. He'd won the battle by any measure. Killed 2,000 Romans, broke a punitive expedition, proved Germania couldn't be pacified through conventional military pressure. But he'd lost the innovation race. Rome had adapted faster, would continue adapting, would systematize and deploy and integrate war dogs until they became standard rather than experimental. That's what empires did. Not win every battle, win every adaptation cycle, turn failures into lessons, turn lessons into systems, turn systems into permanent advantages that accumulated over generations. In the kennels, Ferox's breathing steadied into sleep. The dog dreamed, legs twitching, soft sounds suggesting he was tracking something in unconscious memory. Hunting patterns burned so deep that even sleep couldn't turn them off. That was 40 generations of selective breeding. That was 20 years of tactical development. That was what Rome had created and deployed and proven in forest combat that would be studied in military academies for 2,000 years. They'd laughed at Rome's dogs once. The dispatch riders reached Rome 17 days after the forest, 3 copies carried by different routes because command assumed Germanic forces might intercept messages that documented disaster on this scale. The Senate received casualty reports, tactical assessments, and recommendations written by a garrison commander who'd survived through desperate innovation but knew his career had ended the moment he'd marched 2,600 men into an ambush that intelligence failures had made inevitable. Velius wrote the truth because lies wouldn't survive Senate investigation. 2,000 Romans dead, Germanic Confederation still operational. Frontier pacification failed, but attached to the disaster report was something else. An operational assessment of war dog performance, written with the kind of detail that suggested this might be the only positive outcome worth salvaging from complete tactical failure. The Senate debate lasted 6 hours. Conservatives argued that Germania should be abandoned, that the frontier cost too much blood and gold for territory that produced nothing Rome couldn't acquire elsewhere. Expansionists argued that abandoning Germania would signal weakness, would encourage uprisings in other provinces, would cost more in the long run than reinforcing and adapting. The compromise was predictable. No abandonment, no major reinforcement, just policy adjustment and tactical innovation. The war dog program got expanded because senators read casualty projections and understood that 800 survivors meant the dogs had worked. Cost-benefit analysis favored breeding more molossians over deploying more legions. Velius was recalled to Rome, promoted to administrative position where his tactical failures couldn't kill more soldiers, but his innovations could influence frontier policy. The promotion was exile dressed as honor. He spent the rest of his career writing doctrine manuals for war dog deployment, training protocols for handlers, breeding guidelines for kennels. His disaster became case study. His dogs became legion standard. History would remember Teutoburg as Germanic victory and Roman humiliation. History would forget that the humiliation birthed tactical evolution that lasted centuries. At Colonia Claudia, the kennel expansion began immediately. Budget tripled. Handler positions increased from 8 to 24. Breeding facilities enlarged to accommodate 80 dogs with infrastructure supporting 200. The program that had been experimental proof of concept became operational requirement. Every frontier legion received orders to establish similar programs within 2 years. Some complied immediately because their commanders had lost soldiers to ambushes and understood dogs offered capability infantry couldn't match. Some resisted because conservative officers saw expensive animals as resource drain that solved problems better discipline could handle. But resistance meant casualties, and casualties meant Senate investigations, and investigations meant career endings. Within 5 years, 6 frontier legions operated war dog programs. Within 10 years, the number reached 12. Lucius stayed at Colonia training the next generation of handlers. The shoulder wound that had ended his frontline career meant field deployment was finished, but training was possible. He spent 7 years teaching young handlers how to read dog behavior, how to coordinate pack tactics, how to understand that molossians weren't pets or tools, but soldiers with different capabilities and different costs. The handlers who learned from him deployed across the empire carrying knowledge he'd earned in forest combat that had killed half his dogs and changed Roman tactical doctrine permanently. Ferox recovered. The shoulder wound healed badly, left him with limited range of motion that ended combat certification. He could still move, could still train, but the explosive speed that made war dogs effective was gone. Clytos wanted to retire him to breeding stock because his genetics were combat-proven and valuable. Lucius refused. He's earned retirement on his terms, not ours. The dog lived another 8 years. spent them in the kennels supervising puppy training with the kind of authority that came from being veteran when every other dog was recruit. The young Molossians learned from him through observation and pack dynamics that human handlers couldn't replicate. When he died, old and tired and surrounded by the puppies he'd helped shape, Lucius buried him outside the kennels with a marker stone, inscribed in Greek because Cleitos insisted, and Latin because Lucius did. The inscription read simply, Ferox, faithful. That marker lasted 300 years before Germanic tribes overran the Rhine frontier and burned everything Rome had built. Archaeological excavations in the 19th century found the stone fragment, weathered but readable, filed in a museum collection with thousands of other Roman artifacts. The dog's name survived. His story didn't. That's how history works. Remembers the wrong things and forgets the important ones. But the legacy didn't need memory to spread. Within a generation of Teutoburg, war dogs were standard frontier deployment. Training doctrine became systematized. Breeding programs operated at scale. Handlers developed professional identity separate from regular infantry. The evolution happened quietly through policy memos and budget allocations and tactical manuals that codified innovation into procedure. Rome didn't celebrate the dogs in triumph arches or victory monuments. They just integrated them into military structure until presence became normal and normal became invisible. Germanic tribes noticed. Arminius survived another decade after Teutoburg, spent it fighting tribal rivals and Roman reprisal expeditions that kept coming despite the disaster. He won some, lost others, learned that defeating one Roman expedition just meant facing another the next season. But the war dogs kept appearing in Roman columns, kept disrupting ambush tactics that had worked perfectly before Molossians entered the tactical equation. Arminius tried countermeasures, longer spears to maintain distance, tighter formations to present unified defense, leather leg wrappings to blunt the hamstring attacks dogs preferred. The countermeasures worked partially. Germanic casualties from dog attacks decreased, but partial success meant Germanic warriors were spending combat attention on defending against animals instead of engaging infantry, which gave Romans tactical advantage they exploited efficiently. The dogs didn't need to kill everyone. They just needed to create enough disruption that Roman infantry could do what Roman infantry did best. Close quarters combat with discipline and technique that beat courage and numbers when the fight happened on Roman terms. So Germanic tribes started acquiring Molossians, not through breeding programs, because that required decades of infrastructure Rome had invested in. Through raids, through purchase from corrupt suppliers, through defecting handlers willing to sell knowledge for gold or sanctuary. The dogs were valuable enough that stealing them made economic sense. Within 20 years of Teutoburg, Germanic warriors were deploying their own war dogs, smaller programs, less systematic, but functional enough to neutralize Roman advantage in this specific domain. The tactical evolution accelerated. Romans bred larger Molossians with higher aggression. Germanic tribes countered with dogs trained for defensive operations rather than assault. Both sides developed handler specializations, communication protocols, integration tactics. The innovation arms race that started with 40 dogs in a forest spread across the frontier and persisted for generations. Not because dogs were revolutionary weapons that changed warfare fundamentally, because they were marginal advantage that accumulated over thousands of small engagements into strategic capability neither side could abandon without accepting tactical disadvantage. Historians writing centuries later missed this completely. They documented the battles, the emperors, the conquest timelines, the political transitions. They described Roman military might through legionary discipline and engineering prowess. War dogs appeared in texts as curiosities, exotic details that added color without substance. The systematic programs, the breeding infrastructure, the tactical integration, the Germanic counter-adoption, all of it got compressed into footnotes and passing mentions that suggested dogs were interesting but not important. The archaeological evidence told different story. Excavations at Roman military sites across the Rhine-Danube frontier found kennel structures sized for 40 to 60 dogs, built with the same permanence as barracks and granaries. Found specialized equipment, spiked collars in various sizes, leather armor pieces, feeding troughs designed for pack animals, medical instruments sized for veterinary care, burial sites where dogs were interred with military honors, positioned like soldiers, sometimes with handlers buried nearby. The physical remains documented infrastructure that required enormous investment and suggested operational importance texts had dismissed. Modern analysis of those remains produced additional insights. DNA extracted from teeth and bone fragments showed selective breeding patterns consistent with high-intensity trait selection over multiple generations. Size increase, jaw structure modification, skeletal markers suggesting animals bred for strength and aggression rather than endurance or appearance. The Molossians Rome deployed weren't the shepherding dogs Greeks had developed. They were engineered variants optimized for specific military applications through breeding programs that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of heredity and trait selection, which meant Rome was practicing applied genetics 1,500 years before Mendel formalized inheritance patterns, not through scientific method or theoretical framework, through empirical observation and systematic record-keeping that documented which bloodlines produced superior working dogs and which didn't. The wax tablets found at Colonia and other sites contained breeding records spanning decades, noting sires and dams, temperament evaluations, combat performance assessments, retirement causes, data collection that enabled optimization without understanding the genetic mechanisms being manipulated. That capability survived Rome's collapse. Germanic tribes maintained breeding programs after the frontier dissolved. Medieval European nobility bred war dogs and hunting dogs using techniques inherited from Roman programs. Through chain of transmission, nobody documented, but archaeological and genetic evidence confirmed. Modern working dog programs trace lineage through these medieval breeds back to Roman Molossians, that traced back to Greek shepherding dogs, that traced back to Mastiff-type ancestors, domesticated thousands of years earlier. The tactical applications evolved, but the core concept persisted. Dogs that track, attack, intimidate. Dogs trained to obey instantly under stress. Dogs integrated with human formations to extend capabilities beyond what humans achieve alone. Every modern military and police working dog performs functions Roman handlers would recognize immediately: scent tracking, patrol, controlled aggression. The technology changed from leather collars to GPS harnesses, from hand signals to radio commands. The mission stayed identical. Lucius wouldn't have understood GPS or radio, but he'd have understood the Belgian Malinois running perimeter security at forward operating bases in Afghanistan, would have recognized the training protocols, the handler relationship, the integration with infantry units. The dogs were different breeds with different names, but the operational concept was his. The handlers spoke different languages and served different empires, but their tactical problems were his problems. How to maintain discipline under fire. How to prevent dogs from pursuing too far. How to balance aggressive training against control requirements. How to accept that some dogs won't come back and sending them anyway, because the mission demands it. 20 years after Teutoburg, Lucius retired from active service. Too old for training yard work, too valuable to waste. The Legion appointed him senior advisor to Frontier Command on war dog operations, administrative position that kept him reviewing deployment reports, training outcomes, breeding program performance across multiple garrisons. He'd started as wounded legionary, assigned to dog handling, because the posting was where disabled soldiers went to finish their service. He ended as subject matter expert whose recommendations influenced tactical doctrine for 8 legions. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd thought dog handling was exile, had resented the assignment, had felt diminished by proximity to animals instead of soldiers. Then Teutoburg had demonstrated that the animals were soldiers, just different species, and the handlers who understood them were force multipliers worth more than additional infantry because they enabled capabilities no amount of discipline could generate. His exile had been promotion. His diminishment had been education. His resentment had been ignorance. He died at 53, old for legionary veterans, comfortable in retirement home the Legion provided. Clydos had died 2 years earlier. Training accident that killed him and the dog he'd been working with when young handler made mistake that cascaded into tragedy. The Greek had been buried with military honors because by then handlers ranked with combat veterans rather than support staff. His wax tablets containing 30 years of breeding records and training observations became foundational texts for expanding programs across the empire. Ferox had been dead 15 years by the time Lucius died, but the dog's genetics persisted through breeding program that had used him extensively before the shoulder wound ended combat certification. Descendants served in legions from Britannia to Syria. The bloodline that produced exceptional tracking ability and pack coordination and controlled aggression spread through Roman military kennels and eventually through Germanic breeding programs and medieval hunting stock and modern working dog populations. Genetic analysis done 2,000 years later would find markers connecting ancient Molossian remains to contemporary working breeds, hereditary chains spanning 2 millennia, and proving that Roman selective breeding had been effective enough to embed permanent traits in canine populations. The story should end with legacy and spread and lasting impact that validated innovation. But history doesn't work that way. The innovations spread, the infrastructure persisted, the tactical applications evolved, but the memory died. Within 3 centuries of Teutoburg, the war dog programs had been so thoroughly integrated into standard military operations that nobody remembered they'd been innovation. They were just normal, part of how Rome operated. The breeding programs, the handler training, the tactical doctrine, all of it became institutional knowledge that nobody questioned or celebrated because it had always been there as far as anyone remembered. Then, the empire collapsed, the legions dissolved, the frontier infrastructure disintegrated. The breeding programs survived through medieval nobility, but the systematic approach died. The tactical integration vanished. The handler specialization ended. War dogs became hunting dogs, became guard dogs, became pets. The capability degraded across generations from precision military instrument to general purpose animal. The institutional knowledge that had taken decades to develop disappeared within a generation of empire's fall. Germanic tribes remembered. Oral traditions preserved stories about Roman dogs that fought like demons and couldn't be stopped by normal warriors. The stories got exaggerated over centuries until the Molossians became mythological rather than historical. Giant beasts with supernatural powers rather than 80-pound dogs with excellent training. The truth was mundane. The myth was memorable. So myth survived and truth died. Modern military working dog programs reinvented everything Rome had figured out, rediscovered through trial and error that dogs needed systematic breeding for temperament and capability, relearned that training required 18 months minimum and failure rates ran 40%. Redeveloped integration tactics that let dogs extend infantry capabilities without creating coordination problems. Every lesson Rome had documented on wax tablets and encoded in doctrine manuals had to be discovered again because the transmission chain had broken and institutional knowledge had vanished. That cycle repeats through history. Innovation appears, solves problems, becomes normal, gets forgotten, collapses, gets reinvented by people who don't know they're repeating ancient solutions to permanent problems. Military working dogs aren't special in this pattern. They're typical. Humans solve problems, systematize solutions, forget why the system exists, lose the capability, rediscover necessity, reinvent the solution. The technology changes, but the pattern doesn't. Archaeological sites across Roman frontier contain evidence of this cycle. Kennel structures that show sophisticated design, then degradation, then abandonment, then later medieval construction on top that reuses materials without understanding original purpose. The physical remains document forgetting in real time. Infrastructure built for specific purpose, repurposed by people who couldn't read the engineering intent because context had disappeared. But here's what survived all the forgetting: the dogs themselves. Breeds descended from Roman molossians persist in modern populations. Working ability persists in bloodlines that never completely lost it. Capability persists in genetic markers that 2,000 years of breeding couldn't erase. The institutions collapsed, the knowledge scattered, the techniques vanished. But the biology endured because biology doesn't require anyone remembering why it exists. It just exists and reproduces and carries forward the traits that earlier selection had embedded. That's the actual legacy, not the tactical victories or the breeding programs or the handler specializations. The biological reality that selective breeding works and its effects persist longer than civilizations. Rome bred dogs for specific military applications using empirical methods that worked despite no theoretical understanding. Those applications created selection pressure that modified populations. The modifications persisted through Roman collapse, medieval period, modern era. Contemporary working dogs carry genetic heritage from Roman programs whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Lucius never knew any of this. He trained dogs, deployed them in combat that killed half and validated the rest, spent decades systematizing knowledge for handlers who came after. He thought he was solving tactical problem specific to Rhine frontier in early 1st century. He was actually contributing to biological modification program that would influence canine populations for millennia. The tactical problem got solved and forgotten. The biological modification persisted and spread. That gap between what people think they're doing and what they're actually doing is where history happens. Arminius thought he was defending Germania from Roman conquest. He was actually accelerating arms race that would end with both sides deploying war dogs and neither side able to abandon the capability without tactical disadvantage. Velius thought he was salvaging disaster through desperate innovation. He was actually demonstrating proof of concept that would become legion standard and spread across empire. The Senate thought it was making budget allocation for experimental program. It was actually funding applied genetics research that would run for centuries and produce lasting biological change. Nobody involved understood the scale of what they were creating. They were solving immediate problems with available resources. The problems got solved. The solutions had consequences nobody predicted. The consequences accumulated into changes that outlasted the original context by 2,000 years. Modern special operations soldiers working with Belgian Malinois in hostile territory are executing tactical concept Lucius developed during forest fighting. He barely survived. The dogs are different breeds. The equipment is different technology. The enemy is different organization. But the mission is identical. Track, engage, disrupt, enable infantry to exploit advantages the dogs create. The tactical logic hasn't changed because the underlying mathematics hasn't changed. Humans have certain capabilities. Dogs have different capabilities. Combining them generates force multiplication that pure human formations can't match. That's not profound truth or deep insight. It's observation about coordination between different capability sets producing outcomes neither can achieve alone. Rome figured this out through desperation and applied it through institutional systematization. Modern militaries figured it out again through different desperation and applied it through different systematization. The pattern is universal. The specifics are historical accidents, which brings us back to that forest in 7 CE. Arminius watching Roman column emerge from mist, counting his warriors, calculating his advantage, preparing to spring trap that intelligence and preparation had made inevitable. Then seeing dogs flow between legionary ranks and understanding immediately that something had changed, something his planning hadn't accounted for. Something that turned certain victory into survivable defeat for forces he'd already outmaneuvered and outnumbered. He'd laughed at Roman dogs before, seen them chained in camps eating garbage, dismissed them as expensive pets that served no military purpose. Most Germanic commanders shared that assessment because dogs were common and military dogs weren't. The distinction looked trivial until it killed 400 warriors in forest combat. Nobody had thought dogs could influence. After Teutoburg, no one laughed. Germanic tribes started acquiring molossians. Roman programs expanded. The tactical innovation spread because both sides understood that advantage had shifted, and refusing to adapt meant accepting permanent disadvantage. The dogs became normal, then mundane, then forgotten by historians who documented battles, but missed the force multiplication systems that determined outcomes. 2,000 years later, archaeological excavations find kennel structures and burial sites, and equipment remains. Find evidence of programs that required enormous investment and suggested operational importance. Historians rewrite assessments. Acknowledge that war dogs mattered in ways contemporary sources hadn't documented because military infrastructure is boring and battles are interesting. The revision takes 2 millennia, but eventually happens because physical evidence can't be dismissed even when texts ignore it. Lucius's marker stone for ferox survives in museum archives. Fragment labeled and cataloged but not displayed because singular dog burial isn't exhibition-worthy compared to triumph arches and imperial statuary. The stone documents that someone cared enough to memorialize animal with human honors. That care suggests relationship deeper than handler and tool. Suggests recognition that the dog had earned status beyond utility. That recognition was heresy by Roman standards. Animals weren't persons, didn't have status, existed to serve human purposes. But handlers who fought beside dogs that obeyed unto death developed relationships doctrine couldn't account for. The relationships were tactically irrelevant, but psychologically significant. Made handlers care about breeding programs and training protocols and deployment decisions in ways pure calculation couldn't generate. Made them advocate for expansion and systematization because dogs weren't just tools anymore. They were soldiers who happened to be different species. That heretical recognition never became official doctrine, but it influenced program development anyway. Kennels built with same permanence as barracks. Dogs retired with honors rather than destroyed when combat ineffective. Handlers achieving professional identity and specialist status. All of it suggested institutional acknowledgement that war dogs occupied category between tool and soldier, even if doctrine couldn't formally recognize it. Modern military working dog programs face identical tension. Official policy treats dogs as equipment. Handler culture treats them as team members. The contradiction persists because both perspectives are simultaneously true and mutually exclusive. Dogs are expensive assets requiring resource investment and loss prevention. Dogs are living beings forming relationships with handlers and demonstrating agency within operational constraints. Both statements are accurate. Neither fully captures reality. That unresolvable tension between instrumental value and recognized agency is where war dog programs exist. Roman handlers felt it. Modern handlers feel it. The dogs don't care because dogs live in present without abstract philosophical categories. They obey, track, attack, rest. The complications are human problems that don't affect canine experience. Lucius understood this eventually, started his service thinking dogs were tools that performed functions, ended his career, understanding dogs were soldiers with different capabilities who performed missions. The shift wasn't sentimental. It was recognition that instrumental thinking missed aspects of capability that mattered operationally. Dogs that bonded with handlers performed better than dogs that didn't. Dogs that experienced combat together developed coordination that training couldn't replicate. Dogs that survived engagements learned lessons that made them more effective in subsequent deployments. All of this required treating dogs as agents rather than instruments, even when doctrine classified them as equipment. That recognition is his actual legacy. Not the breeding programs or tactical innovations or handler training protocols. The understanding that force multiplication requires relationship, not just coordination. That capability emerges from trust, not just command. That soldiers can be different species without being lesser warriors. Modern handlers learn this same lesson through same experience. The institutional knowledge still gets forgotten and rediscovered each generation. But the lesson itself persists because it's observation about reality rather than doctrine about hierarchy. If you made it this far, you've witnessed innovation born from desperation and spread through institutional momentum until it became invisible through normalization. But here's the question historians miss. What innovations are surrounding you right now that will seem obvious to future generations but remain contested or invisible in present? The next century will look back at our period and wonder why certain capabilities weren't systematically deployed despite obvious utility. We're living in the moment before normalization, unable to see what later becomes foundational. That's the universal pattern. Innovation appears threatening until proven, proven until normal, normal until forgotten. Rome's war dogs followed this arc completely. Modern working dogs are following it now. Whatever innovations your grandchildren deploy without thought are being fought over in committee meetings and budget hearings happening while you're watching this. The cycle never stops, just changes form and repeats with different details and same structure. Witness it. If you made it this far, you've just witnessed how 40 dogs changed Roman military doctrine and influenced warfare for 2 millennia. But here's what I want to know. What modern military or police working dog operations do you think would surprise ancient Roman handlers the most? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to see how other minor Roman innovations cascaded into permanent changes nobody remembers, check out the video I just dropped on Roman military logistics, the boring systems that actually won the empire. Link in the description. Hit subscribe if you're tired of history that celebrates the wrong things and forgets the important ones. New video every week diving into the machinery behind events everyone thinks they understand. Now get out of here and go appreciate that German Shepherd or Belgian Malinois you see working. They're carrying 2,000 years of genetics and tactical evolution. They just don't know it.